Welcome, everyone, and welcome, Julia Lillethun. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It is our honor to have you with us. Julia, your survivor's story is different from some of our other guests. Please share with our listeners what you are comfortable with sharing of your story and your healing journey.
Okay. A little over 25 years ago, I was doing a paper route in Billings, Montana with my 14-year-old daughter and two of her friends. And we had started off pretty early that morning. The girls were going to leave town for Labor Day weekend. And it was pretty dark out, and one of the gals just kept saying, something's not right. It's off. I feel like somebody's watching us. And I said, we're fine. Safety in numbers. And it's just because it's so dark out, it just seems creepy. We're okay. We'll be fine. We finished up the route and went back over to Gibson's on Broadwater. And the girls didn't feel comfortable with my continuing walking on. My boyfriend had my car that morning because my son was sick. So my boyfriend at the time was doing that paper route with my car. And we were supposed to meet at Broadwater and 24th. And the girls tried to talk me into going with them and then just having my boyfriend come over and pick us up at the house. But it was a beautiful morning and there were several joggers out, so I felt I was safe. I walked on and I got almost down to 24th Street and I heard some heavy footsteps. Just a heavy person running behind me. And I just assumed it was another one of the joggers that I had seen that morning. And then I just felt like I had been bowled over, knocked the wind out of me. He came up behind me and instantly put me in a chokehold. He was trying to drag me in between two businesses. And I remember being told to not let them take you to a secondary location if you are attacked, to fight like heck. And I fought with everything I had. I dug my heels in. I swung from side to side, but he was stronger than I was. I could smell the meth and the alcohol on him. And he was successful in getting me back to the fence in between those two buildings. And he produced a knife and told me that if I did everything he said, he would let me go. But I knew he was lying. I knew that it wasn't going to end well. When something like that happens, at first you're just in shock that it's even happening. Like, where did he come from? And, why is this happening to me? And he was out of breath and he had shoved me to the ground and I was in a fetal position and he was laying over my back with his full weight on me while he was trying to catch his breath because I put up a heck of a fight. And I felt I had to get away from it. I tried to sit back up with him, pushing him backward. And it was like trying to push back against a wall. I kept thinking, they say a lot of times your life flashes before you, and I wasn't even thinking about that. It was more, how am I going to get out of this? I tried to talk to him, to let him see me as not just a target, but a human being. And I told him that I was a single mother of two children. At the time, I was fighting thyroid cancer, and I had just received an I-131 treatment, which is a radioactive isotope. So I was radioactive. You excrete it in, sweat and spit and everything. So he was being exposed to that radiation. None of it fazed him. It was like he was determined to rape and attack me. And also, I turned my head to try to look back, and he said, "Don't look at me or I'll kill you." I knew I had to do something. I kept thinking, what am I going to do to get him to set that knife down so I can throw it over the fence? And I asked him if he had a condom, and he said, "Oh, yeah." And he set the knife down, and while he was fumbling in his pockets, I reached over to grab the knife to throw it over the fence, but I was too slow. I think fear of, retaliation, what would happen if I didn't succeed, and I didn't. And it made him extremely angry. He put me in a chokehold instantly, and I could feel myself blacking out. And I knew if I passed out that it was done. It was lights out. I was a goner. I pulled down on his arm and moved my chin into the crook of his elbow and pushed down really hard and was able to get in some life-saving breaths. And then he told me to take off my clothes, and I said no. And I was thinking to myself, if you want it, you're going to have to work for it, because I'm not giving it up. And he was instantly just enraged, and he launched into a very vicious rape. And I had been sexually molested when I was 10 years old, and I had gone through some other traumas as a child. And I just remember being just angry. And then I was also, thinking, well, what about my children? They're 13 and 14. And their father was, like my father, was an alcoholic and abusive. And I didn't want my kids to grow up like I had. I had been there for all their first word, their first step, everything. And I wanted to be there for their first prom, their sweet 16, graduation, getting married, having children, having a family. And I knew I had to reserve my strength. So I basically just shut down emotionally and then just let him. I kept thinking he's the one that's expanding all his energy and I'm reserving mine. So when he was done, he turned his back to get his clothes. I still had my t-shirt on and that's all I had. And I made the mistake of turning my back to him. And he came up behind me and started stabbing me in the throat and the face over and over. And he tried to stab me in the back of my head at the base of my skull. And I was able to deflect those blows. My hands had several stab wounds in them. And then he came back around with a knife and he was aiming straight for my esophagus from the front. And I grabbed the knife and pulled up with his hand and the knife. And then he pulled back down and almost severed my thumb off. And it was on my prominent hand. I knew I couldn't keep fighting him. I was exhausted. I was super mad. And pardon the language, but this is where I was at that moment. I was pissed because I had enough in my life. I am just like, the bullies, the abuse, just continual. And I was fed up. And I thought, if you're going to try to kill me, you son of a bitch, you're going to have to earn it. It just seemed like an eternity. In the process of fighting him, we were kicking up dust, and I have severe asthma. I could feel an asthma attack coming on. I didn't have my inhaler with me. And I knew that I just couldn't keep at full throat. I just couldn't keep fighting him at 100%. So I started gurgling on the blood that was in my mouth. And then I just went and fell to the ground. And then he looked up and there were several cars. Traffic was picking up because it was almost 6 a.m. I could tell he was worried about being seen. And he kept looking down at me. And when he'd look down, I'd hold my breath. And then he'd look up at the traffic. And I think he figured, that I was on my way out or he had succeeded. And he got up and ran away from the scene. And I knew I had to run for help. I was petrified and scared he was going to come back and finish, what he had started. It took me several attempts to get up on my feet. I kept falling back down. I was using my left hand to hold my throat and hold all the wounds shut. My shirt was drenched. And I finally stumbled into the street, and I can only imagine the sight everybody saw and how traumatic it probably was for them. And I went out in the street and was waving my other arm. I had used my shorts to wrap around my thumb, and I was just in my t-shirt and that was it. But a lot of people would either just look straight ahead like I wasn't there and keep driving, or I would get the head turning and looking all the way, as they passed, continually looking at me as they were driving away. Nobody would stop. And I felt I was going to bleed out in the street. I went back onto the sidewalk and walked over to a house, but it had been renovated into a business and nobody was there. So I went back out onto the street and there were a few more cars and they did the same. They just kept driving. There was one car at the very end. She did drive by and then she slammed on her brakes and backed up. And she was on her way to work at the Metro. She saw me and she was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't let you in my car." And I was like, "I don't need to be in your car. Can you please just go get help?" Back then, those were the days when the cell phones were in the car, those monstrosities with the big long cord. So she told me she would run back and call for help. And then I told her I would be on the corner there on Broadwater and 24th. And she said she would tell the first responders. that that's where I was. So I walked right up to that spot, and then I just stood there and waited, and my knees were so weak. I felt like I was just going to pass out and collapse. And I just kept telling myself, I have to hang in there just a little bit longer, just a little bit longer. I had lost a lot of blood. I saw AMR pull up across the street. Back then it was an IGA store, if I remember right. Oh, no, wait, it was a furniture store. And I saw them staging across the street. So I knew. I later became an EMT, but I grew up around the medical field. So I knew that they couldn't come on scene until the police officers had cleared it. So I just knew help was just right across the street, and it was just a matter of time, and I could hang in there. There was a woman that was driving. Her husband was driving her to work. She was a nurse, and they stopped to stay with me. And the husband got a sheet out and wrapped it around my waist. I went into panic mode because I was so afraid of them being exposed to that radiation. And I kept telling them, it's not safe. And they were like, no, we're fine. We're going to stay with you until somebody gets here. And the officers, there was probably about 7 cars just instantly surrounding us. I went over my story a couple times so that they could kind of get an idea of where it had happened and what had happened. And I couldn't give him a description because I didn't look, because he told me not to look. Anyway, then I was loaded up in the ambulance, and I thought, I'm safe. It's all over. It's done. Now I can heal and get through this. But the rape itself and the attack was just a part of it. It got worse from there, if that can be worse. But as far as the healing part was really hard. In the ambulance, the adrenaline was wearing off, and I could feel the pain. So I was begging the paramedic for something for the pain. And she just looked from side to side on my neck, and she's like, oh, it's not that bad. And that was the final straw for me that morning. I felt I had fought so hard to survive. I felt every stab wound. They usually say you can't feel it, your body will numb, but I felt it. The first initial, it was worse than a paper cut. You could just feel that knife searing into my throat. But then, the adrenaline did kick in and everything went numb. But when that adrenaline wears off, it's extremely painful. I just had to just grit my teeth and get through it. Got to the ER. And unbeknownst to me, while I was going for help, there were a couple of gentlemen that had phones in their trucks, and they did call it in. And one of my dearest friends was a 911 dispatcher, and she took the calls that morning. She did not, or a couple of calls. She didn't know it was me, but until the officers were struggling with my last name. And she had heard the Julia, and they were, struggling to say Lillethun. And she was, oh my God, you're not talking about Julia Lillethun, are you? And they said, yes. So she had called up there to the ER, found out which hospital. The ambulance had already reported which hospital I was going to. And the nurse had come in and said, your friend Artie would like to come up and was wondering if you wanted her to come in. And I said, yes. So she came in, and she was with me while they were working on me, trying to stop the bleeding. And doctor said he was just going to suture up the wounds and send me home. We asked for a second opinion, and the ear, nose, and throat doctor came in, and he said, this girl's going nowhere but into surgery. So they had stopped the bleeding. While we were waiting for an operating room to open, they decided to do the SANE exam, which that in itself is humiliating, and it's a hard thing to get through, especially after you've been violated. And then once that was over, Artie was there with me, holding my hand through the whole thing. I went into surgery. I remember waking up in a room, and the doctor came in to do his rounds, and he had said that it was a miracle I had survived, that my angels were truly with me that morning, and that not very many people would have survived an violent attack like that. So then began, the healing process. You never really realize how much you use your hands until you can't. I was in a splint, and my hand was in a perfect L 24/7, and it was excruciating. I had other surgeries I had to go through for my hands. Going through the PTSD and the panic attacks and the anxiety, checking the doors and the locks every 5 minutes, the nightmares and night terrors. I just could not put my kids through that anymore. So I made the decision to have them go stay with loved ones and our friends, trying to get through the trauma and then feeling like a failure as a mother. I had forgot to mention that I had brachial plexus injury when he stabbed down, and he stabbed downward into my chest in between the collarbone here and severed several nerves into my right arm. So when I get a hug from my grandkids or a friend or anybody, it's like an instant electrical jolt, and it's extremely painful. And I also had a torn rotator cuff from trying to fight him off. So the constant, going to physical therapy, and I just felt I couldn't be there for the kiddos. And in between all of that, I was constantly down at the police station with the detectives, going over my story over and over. And that's traumatic because you're reliving it. I understood why they were doing what they were doing in hopes that something would jar my memory and that I could remember something to give them to go upon. And I remember one day it was just too much and I had to step out. And I came back toward the room. I was going to go in, and there were several in the room. And I heard them saying that my affect was flat and that I wasn't acting like somebody that had been through a traumatic event. And that just exacerbated my social awkwardness. And then it also made me angry. It was like, is there a handbook on how I'm supposed to react? Am I supposed to get hysterical or cry? Or, I had been through so much trauma, and it was just another thing to add to the mix for me. I just had learned that it really didn't do me any good to cry or react, because I would always get, you just got to put your big girl pants on and you got to, pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And it was really hard to hear that from the detectives who are, to me, were there to protect and serve. And then I felt let down because they were judging how I was handling something so traumatic. I started also with self-doubt and hatred. I was angry at myself, and I felt like I had let the detectives down because I didn't get a look at him because he had told me not to. And I wanted to show him I was complying. I wanted to survive to be there for my kids. I was angry at myself. It was like, you dumb bitch, why didn't you get a good look at him? Because he tried to kill you anyway. It was all for nothing. If you would have gotten a good look at him, you could give them a description, something that would help them find him. And then once you're done with that and you go through that, it's out in the paper, it's in the press, then you start hearing people in the store and not knowing that you were the victim. I heard several people talking about it because it was on the front page of the Gazette as you went through the line. There were a couple women that were talking about it. And at that time, it was just right after Miranda Benner had been murdered. And they said something to the effect, what a shame. Why did this other woman have to survive and this poor girl not? And the cashier, I went through her line all the time. She's an amazing lady. I just remember her telling them that's a horrible thing to say. And then after she had wrung them out, she told them to do her a favor and never go through her line ever again. I called it the court of public opinion. I would also hear people would say this to my face. If it had been me, I would have kneed him in the balls and I would have ran. I don't care how you would have handled it. Because then again, I felt I was being judged. And then you go through the victim shaming and blaming. Why was she wearing shorts? Why was she out that early in the morning? It's just never ending. And then I would get, from loved ones or people that thought they were being helpful. God never gives you more than you can handle. And I used to feel like the next person that says that to me, I'm going to frickin' slap them. I was just so frustrated and tired of being judged and put down. And when I would talk about it, because I didn't want to hold it in, then I would get she just wants people to feel sorry for her. I don't feel sorry for her. Oh, would you just get over it? It happened 2 months ago. You should be over it by now. So I just do what worked for me as a child. Back then it was like you didn't talk about sexual assault or abuse. And I was 10 when it first happened to me. And I just learned to just stuff it, and just act like it never happened. You put that mask on and you just trudge through the day, every day. I would also get those that would say, you're so strong. I don't know how you do it. And I wasn't strong. I was not functioning or barely functioning. I could barely get up in the morning. I would wear the same pajamas 3 days, 4 days in a row. I felt like such a failure. I tried a half-hearted attempt at suicide. And luckily I had a dear friend that I adored, and She called me and she said, something just told me I needed to call you. She was a victim witness coordinator for Yellowstone County. She helped me through a lot. I was just so tired of the pain, the mental and the physical. Then that was another thing to heap on myself. A lot of my suffering that I went through was self-imposed. The rape culture, the falsehoods and things that are out there. I just felt frustrated and unheard, unseen. I mean, I had been seen as the victim, but unseen as a human being. And my brother and my family were just such a big part of my healing. But then, some of the other family members would be really uncomfortable with talking about it. And it was like, we've heard this over and over again. Can you just please stop talking about it? And I get it. As a secondary survivors, their trauma is just as real, but they go through a different trauma. And that was another thing that was really hard for me to watch, is to see the pain that it caused. The ripple effect. It wasn't just me and my family either. It was the community as a whole. They rallied around me in a big way, but to see women that were afraid to go out and they couldn't keep pepper spray on the shelves for months after that. It was ever reaching. And for some reason, as trauma victims, we blame ourselves. Well, if I had decided to go a different route, that wouldn't have happened. And I came to the conclusion, the coulda, shoulda, wouldas. I need to stop that dialogue. What happened, happened, and it happened. And I can't go back and change it. And
you survived. You survived.
Yeah.
No one was there helping you at that time to survive. You survived that.
Yes.
You did.
Yes. And I had gone to a self-defense class, and the gentleman that was doing it, we talked afterwards, and we were talking about my attack, and I shared with him that, the people that were saying, I would have kneed him in the balls and ran. And he said, the people that usually say that are the ones that freeze. And he said, every attack is different. Some women that have fought really hard are murdered. Some that fight survive. Everything is different. And he said, you were making life and death decisions in seconds.
That's right.
And you're sitting here in front of me. You made all the right decisions.
That's right.
You have to change what you're telling yourself. You need to be saying, I did everything right. I made it out alive.
That's right.
I made it out alive. I did everything right. So that really was the catalyst, I think, to helping me, go forward and just live my life. I know there was times I would be walking down the sidewalk. Am I walking by him? He was out there. They hadn't caught him. There was a woman that was raped 7 days after I was. There was a young girl, I think she was 17, that was on her porch. She had accidentally locked herself out, and somebody had tried to grab her off of her porch. And then Miranda was murdered. And so there were other things that were happening in the community, and they didn't know if they were all, related. I did feel a connection to Miranda's case. And they said 2 totally different MOs. Don't even go there. They're not related at all. So I just picked up and raised my kids. They went through so much. They were left with a mom that was a shell of herself. They didn't have the true direction that children need. And I felt like I had let them down so much. But they're so strong and so resilient, and they're amazing people now. They always have been amazing people, but they went through quite a bit of trauma themselves. My daughter had met her husband, and my son had met his wife, and just amazing, amazing people. Our family is so blessed. And then I became a grandma, and I just felt my life was just amazing and going on the right trajectory. Then I got a phone call. 19 years later, we've solved your case. He's come forward, and we need you to come down. It just felt off to me. Like, why would he just come forward and confess in my case just out of the blue 19 years later? But I went down. We went over things. They said he had come forward in the spring, and I'm like, it's August. Why am I just now being told? And they said that they, wanted to make sure that he was the perpetrator, because they said there are a lot of false confessions. They hadn't revealed to me the true reason why he came forward. I just thought it was just my case and that was it. They said that they were waiting for the DNA to come back. It was a 100% match. So they said they were going to try to work a deal so that I didn't have to go through the trauma of a trial, and that they were going to try for life without the possibility of parole. And I think I just grabbed onto that hope that he would pay for what he did. There was always that why. Why did it happen? I think I was just obsessed with finding out why me. They asked me to be patient and wait. It was a 2-year process. They wanted to ensure that they dotted their I's and crossed their T's. They told me who he was, Zachary David O'Neill. I looked him up on the internet, and an old Montana Supreme Court case pulled up. And he had appealed a charge from when he was a teenager that his rights were violated, and he won that case. So I think that's why they were ensuring that he could not come back and appeal and then, have to start from square one and start this whole process over. In the interim, they did ask me to come down. They had been trying to work with him, and he wanted to know if I would be willing to drop the sexual assault without consent charge. And I was, it's a big hell no. And then I thought, well, maybe if it helps, with the case. And then I thought, what am I thinking? The DNA is 100%. So no way. They had also revealed that the main reason he came forward was to confess to Miranda's murder, and that they had asked him if there were anything else he needed to know. And he said, oh yeah, there was a lady on Broadwater that I raped and tried to kill, but she survived because the paper said she didn't die. So I felt like, oh, that's nice. I'm just an afterthought. When it came time for him to plead, the reporters were there, but they were unaware that our cases were linked and that they had solved Miranda's murder. And I could just see, the reporters on their phones and running out story of the year. And they were going to have a big press conference across the street. And they had asked if I wanted to go. And I said, I don't want to be a part of that circus. No, thank you. They set a date for sentencing, which was a month later. I got to go and give my victim impact statement. I remember my counselor telling me, when you go in there, you're going to see him and you're going to think, why was I afraid of him all these years? She said, he's going to be probably not the big monster that I had, When they led him into the courtroom, he was shackled. His feet, his hands were shackled to his waist, and he was trying to make himself look like the smallest person in the room. And that's exactly what I thought. I've been afraid of this for 19 years. Or it was 21 years because it was a 2-year process. Anyway, I got to go up and read my statement and face him, which in itself was liberating. He was deemed a level 3 offender, high-risk violent sexual offender, and he was sentenced to 3 life sentences. For me, I felt like I had been let down, and I know they did the best they could, but it was frustrating. When I had asked how long he had to spend in prison on each life sentence, they said 10 years. And I felt that what I had gone through was more than 10 years, because we get a life sentence. We don't get a break from it. The trauma and the PTSD, you can't turn it off like a light switch. It's always there. And then I was angry, and I felt that Miranda's life was more than 10 years. She had lost her whole life. I did not know her, but we faced that same monster. I had nothing but respect and awe at how hard she had fought. And that survivor's guilt was something that I have dealt with. And I know it's trauma brain. It's not what I had thought, but I thought this way, that if I hadn't have fought so hard to survive, would she still be alive? Because he learned from my attack that my hands were free. I was able to fight and survive. And he bound her with duct tape. And the strength that it took her to get to the door for help through all she had endured. And I thought, and he's getting 10 years for that. And I was angry. I felt like I had been let down. Miranda's family had been let down. The justice system just, to me, it's not fair. For those 2 years I sat on the sidelines, I felt like he was being catered to. And I know that's not the case. That's just trauma, brain. I felt like he had all the say in the world and we had none. A couple months after he was sentenced and taken up to Montana State Prison, I received a call that he had written a letter of apology. And would I like to receive it? They no longer do it this way, but 25 years ago they did. And I said, sure. I don't think I was ready for it, but I received it and I read it. I felt he was sincere the first couple of pages. And then I read, "You're right. Forgiveness is for you and not for me. I just pray Miranda's mom receives that revelation." And I just remember being so disgusted and livid. I just threw it away from me. I didn't even want to touch it anymore. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to see what the rest of it said. And I thought, you killed her precious daughter. You don't have the right to say how she feels and how she handles her grief and what she thinks. You don't have that right. And it took me a while before I picked it up again and finished reading it. I did write a letter. I did respond. I don't know if he did receive it. I decided to just let it go. I don't want him to have another moment of my anger, I was just done. But the demons kept coming and resurfacing. And my dear friend Artie, the
The 911 operator.
The 911 operator, she was battling cancer through that 2-year period. She hung in there and passed after Zach was sentenced. And then I lost my brother to cancer. We lost Sandra a little while later to cancer. And it was just one blow after another. I just wanted to heal so badly. And I remember receiving a notification from Vine that they had transferred Zach to another prison in the state. And then not too long after that, another notification that they were transferring him back to Montana State Prison. And I think I watched too many crime shows. So I called them and I was like, what are you thinking? What if he gets away? What if he, escapes? An angel answered the phone that day, and she was with the victim impact panel. She listened to my story and my journey, and then she asked me if I had heard of it. And I said no. She helped me get in, and I hit the ground running. It's been a long process, but my fellow survivors have been instrumental in my healing, and my faith has been instrumental. I really, really struggled with the faith part after my attack. I just remember being so mad at God and saying, I'm not fucking Job. When is this going to stop? I can't take any more. And then I felt guilty, and I felt I was being disrespectful. And I went and talked to my pastor, and he said, my dear girl, that's why God gave us feelings. He wants us to be mad at him. He's got big shoulders. He wants us to talk to him and tell him how we're feeling. He can take it. It took a long while to work through it and to know that I was given an extraordinary gift, and that's the gift of life. And that I'm still here, and that, you know what? I can make a difference. I can try to help others. I saw something on Facebook. Christina, she does a beautiful disaster on Facebook. And she had showed an hourglass. The bottom part of the hourglass, that's time that's gone. We can't get that back. I can't flip it over and get that time back. I wasted all that time being angry and focused on the why. And I need to focus on this sand that is going through the hourglass. And I don't know how much time I have up here. But I want that time to be meaningful and to be able to use my time to help others, and to just be thankful that I still have that opportunity. To watch all the doors the Lord has opened in the past year has been phenomenal. Jane Doe No More, and they just rolled out a John Doe No More. Victim impact panels help my heart heal, to know that I'm seen, I'm heard, I'm believed, and that I have a voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Julia, thank you for sharing your story with us. It is not easy to tell a story of violence. It's not easy to tell that even 20 plus years later. It's not easy to tell that story. The trauma that a crime victim lives is in the body.
Yes.
That's where the trauma is. The trauma is not out here floating around someplace. That trauma is in the body. That's where you feel that trauma. And it's what was done to you. And it's a lifelong process of dealing with and working through that healing. I've been fortunate to see you over the last few years really thrive within your extraordinary voice. A few things I want to make sure we share with our listeners. If I'm remembering correctly, she was just 18, wasn't she?
Yes.
18, working in a video store in Laurel, Montana. And this piece of shit, Zachary, comes in, think he was going to rob the store to have money for his drug habit. He ends up assaulting her and killing her. And like you, it was clear she fought back. What law enforcement was able to do is they kind of sewed together different pieces of where this guy had been and the violence he had committed within our community. You being able to provide as much information as you did, you being able to endure the SANE exam, you being able to endure all of those steps just to get to the hospital, and then what happened at the hospital. When we think about 1998 and now we're at 2024, it breaks my heart to know that it was just a few years ago in 2019 that Montana made it law that SANE exams have to be processed within a certain period of time. I remember when I was elected onto Billings City Council and I went for a tour of the Billings Police Department's evidence locker, evidence barn. We had gone through all of the different locations of where they store evidence from different crimes. And the very last section they took me to was one that almost dropped me to my knees and took my breath, caused me to be in tears. And it was floor to almost ceiling. You can't put evidence all the way to a ceiling for fire codes, but almost to the ceiling. From one end of the evidence barn to the other end of the evidence barn. And think of Costco shelves or Sam's Club shelves. Stacked, the entire shelving area of this section stacked from one end to the next. Everything was in moving boxes that have handles. And you know what the size of a SANE kit is. It's a small, compact box. Inside each one of these moving boxes were SANE kits.
Oh my God.
Filling each one of those boxes. And I asked, what is this? And when they told me that these are all SANE kits that had not been tested because the crime lab was so overburdened and the backlog was so significant that these SANE kits just get stored. And, the statute of limitations was 10 years. So any kit that hadn't been tested within that 10 years just got thrown away.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Julia, what you've been able to do as a survivor and your voice, you helped law enforcement see the humanity in those kids. When I asked the officers that were giving me the tour, what do you need most from me now that I'm serving on city council? What voice, what actions, what do you need most from me? And this was 2018. Their answer was, help us get these SANE kits tested. Help us with sexual assault. It's one of the most pervasive crimes that we are seeing, and we need help going after these perpetrators and getting help to the victims. You are that voice that helped law enforcement see humanity in those kids. Is every law enforcement officer perfect? Good? No. It's like any other profession. When you have humans involved, there's going to be those that are not quite the greatest of human beings. But you and I have both been very fortunate to work with pretty outstanding law enforcement agents and officers, and those that are there for all the right reasons.
Exactly. And they were definitely part of my case. They truly care.
Yes, absolutely. And sadly, part of our legal system, you called it a justice system. I've stopped calling it that. I call it a legal system. We have a long way to go for this to get back to being, or even to become, maybe I should say, a true justice system. This is a system that is severely broken. But again, we do have good people working within a very challenging and a very tough system.
And their hands are tied with the current laws.
In so many ways, you're absolutely right. With the current laws, yes, exactly. The next thing I want to talk to you about, which you touched on when you were sharing your story with us, and it's something that you and I have talked about before in our friendship. You and I have touched on this subject, and societal norms have put shame of sexual violence on the victim. From your perspective, do you feel as though a paradigm shift is happening, Or do we still have a long way to go to change the stigma attached to being a victim of sexual violence?
I think there's a ways to go. I still hear the same victim shaming and blaming. And one of the victims that had looked me up to talk, she was going through the victim shaming and blaming. They were putting pressure on her from the family. He's going to lose his job. He'll lose his family. Well, that's on him. He made that decision. He made that choice. Why is it that they make excuses for the perpetrator, but shame the victim and make them the bad person? And I still see that to this day. There was the Me Too movement back in 2018, and there's RAINN and Jane Doe No More and other organizations out there. But I feel those societal norms have been here for a long time.
And you use some pronouns that I would say answer the question of why, and you use the pronoun he will lose his job.
Mm-hmm.
His family may become identified.
Mm-hmm.
Our country has a problem with male violence.
Yes.
And we do not want to address male violence. We need to start addressing male violence in this country, because it's not just females that are the victims on the receiving end of male violence. It's males as well.
And female perpetrators also.
Yeah, but very few compared to the amount of male violence we have in our country. But go ahead in regard to what changes do you see happening? You mentioned Jane Doe No More, and in a moment, we're going to talk about the Victim Impact Panel, but what do you see happening within your own family? Do you see a change that occurred within your own family and within your environment?
Yes, I did. I think once they were able to work through their trauma, because like I had stated before, secondary victims, their trauma is just as real. My brother and I were so close. My baby brother was 6'8", but I always called him my baby brother. He erroneously took that on and blamed himself and kept saying, I wasn't there to protect my big sister. And that wasn't his burden to carry. I remember I had thyroid cancer, so I had put on weight from that, but I didn't feel safe. After my attack, I turned to food for comfort and gained weight. Nobody's going to want this big blob. That was my security. And I remember going to visit my family, and my uncle and my grandfather were laughing, and they were like, you're as big as a barn. I just remember, just wanting to leave the room. And then a little while later, I did go off on them, but they had come a long way from that. And in speaking with them, I could see where they had come to the point where it wasn't my fault that it happened. They had expressed, why had I been there to where I could be attacked in the first place? So it's almost like people believe, the woman or the victim or survivors asking for it. But I saw them come a long way in their healing and in their belief system, because I certainly didn't do that to myself, and it wasn't my fault. I didn't go out asking for it, and none of us do.
A victim is never, never, never responsible for what happens to them, the violence that happens, never.
Exactly. And then when you're shut down, because back when I was sexually molested, we didn't talk about that. You just trudged through and you just got it done. That was a non-talking subject.
Our country is very good at protecting the predator.
Exactly. I saw that even within my own family with some of my family members. And I also had heard, I don't have any respect for people that play the victim card. And I was like, how is trying to talk about what happened to me and trying to process through it and trying to understand it, how is that playing the victim card?
Mm-hmm.
And I heard them saying, I don't have respect for people that just can't, be strong and then just get through it and move on with their life. I don't have respect for people that just keep hanging on to the trauma and the pain. And it's not a choice. Those traumas are with us for life. Like I said, it's a life sentence for us.
Yes, it was for my mom. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like throwing glitter in front of a fan in a room, and you can vacuum all you want, but years later, you're still finding that glitter. It's everywhere. And it's not just like the victim. Like I said, it's that ripple effect.
Yeah. Yeah. But something good is happening for you. I've been watching you thrive and enjoying what you post on social media after you've had a great experience, which has been empowering to you. You and I share similar experiences in that we've both gone into prisons to talk to violent offenders. You participate, as you shared, with the VIP program, which stands for Victim Impact Panel, with the Montana Department of Corrections. How has this impacted you, Julia?
It has definitely helped me find my voice. I went into this thinking maybe I was going to make a difference and that hopefully my story would touch at least one of them, that they would go back out into society and not reoffend. And the truth is, the whole experience has really opened my eyes in that the inmates have helped me more, I think, than I have helped them. And a lot of times when I do my story, afterwards I ask if there's any questions. In so many of the panels, I have been asked questions that have really opened up my eyes. They usually always ask the question. They're really curious about the letter that I received from him and how I reacted to it and things like that. And I did share that portion that it made me mad, and it took me a while. And one of the residents raised his hand, and he asked me, or he said, I'm not trying to make an excuse for what he did, because there's no excuse. But maybe when he said that, he meant that he hopes that she comes to that realization for her healing and not his. And I thought, wow, I am coming at this as a survivor in anger at what had happened and why it happened. I'm in tunnel vision, and they have showed me that there are just many ways of looking at things. People see things differently. We all have our own experiences, and we're all redeemable. And a few months later, I went and presented again. And one of the gentlemen at the end, he said, can I ask you what your definition of forgiveness is? Because I had always just kept saying, I've learned to forgive him and move on. Forgiveness is for me and not for him. And, like there's the happy ending, Cinderella ending. And he called me out on it in a nice way. And I so appreciated that, when he said, what is your definition of forgiveness? And it was just like, I get what you're saying. And I looked right at him and I said, you were right. I'm not there yet. I don't think I have fully forgiven him. I'm just reiterating what I was brought up in the church. Forgive and forget. If you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. I'm still pissed as hell at this piece of that he caused so much pain and suffering, and so many people went through so much. I've just been so blessed to be a part of these amazing panels. And like I said, the residents and inmates have helped me more than I had expected. And it's been truly eye-opening, and it's opened my heart. Some of them have shared with me some of their experiences. One guy, he told me that he just chose the wrong path, and he had been through horrendous things, but he just chose the wrong path. Like I said, we're all redeemable. And I've learned just so much from being a part of these panels. And I've learned so much from my fellow survivors. We always joke around that we're a bunch of sickos and, we can talk about all our traumas and, we don't have to hear that, would you just shut up? And it's healing to be heard and to be understood, that they get it. They know where you're coming from, and they know where that pain is coming from, and that you're not a weak person because you can't process it at that very moment, or you can't seem to get through some parts of your trauma.
Yeah. And I understand what you're saying about the empowerment that you feel when you go into the prisons and talk with the inmates.
Just truly blessed.
I had that same experience when I was working in prison ministry down in Oklahoma, working as a volunteer, going in and spending about 3 years of my life doing prison ministry through all of the different facilities throughout the state of Oklahoma. And I too had that same experience of having those one-on-one conversations. And one of the things that I absolutely walked away learning is that prison sentences start long before those bars close, and freedom starts long before those bars open. And it's folks like you, Julia, that have the fortitude to understand and the self-awareness to understand that the action of going in and talking to these inmates is also helping you as well as what we hope and pray, making our environment more safe.
Exactly.
The incarceration system is there for a reason. And there are some people I firmly believe should never be on the street.
And Zachary is one of them.
Yes, I am one that believes if they are redeemed, they can be redeemed in prison and stay there. I have a very harsh view of violent offenders. I do. And I do believe that incarceration systems are appropriate places for violent offenders to be. And that you and I and everyone else out here has the right to live a safe life. The work you're doing is empowering you and your experience with the fellow survivors. And I watch you. I watch how you glow and flourish and your eyes light up. And you post these extraordinary comments on social media about how you came out feeling empowered that day. So I know that it's helping you, and it's so fun and exhilarating and exciting to see you experience that and your face light up when you experience something so positive. The redemption that's happening at that same time is within you.
Yeah, and the healing.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I forgot to mention, I was presenting at a facility up in Great Falls, and I made a trauma mandala, and I was showing it to the female residents. And there happened to be a woman there from a legislative panel that was there to observe that day. I used traumatic colors, red for the crime and the victim, and then orange for the secondary, then yellow, then green, then blue, and how it all intertwined in the depth of the pain, and that each point was trauma that the victim had endured. And I just remember her saying, but the same can be said if you put positive into the circle. And I thought, that is so powerful. So I went home and made a healing mandala, which I show to them too when I do my presentations. And if you put positive in there, do all the hard work and show yourself some grace. And self-love is a big, important part of that.
Absolutely. Well, one of the questions, if you don't mind, can I ask you, and this is something that some of the human trafficking survivors have brought up, what services are needed for victims of sexual violence?
I know working with Jane Doe No More, we received a phone call not too long ago where there was a trafficked young woman and they had nowhere to house her. And I know there are places for housing, but I think there needs to be more. And that's not something that Jane Doe No More, unfortunately, we don't provide that. And my heart just broke and I was sick all night worrying about that precious girl and wondering if they found a place for her, if she was safe. I think the big thing is a place for them to be safe. So many times we're judged by how we react, and a lot of times victims shut down. Had there been something there where I could have turned after my attack, because there wasn't anything. I was just given the pamphlet on how to break the trauma bonds of rape. I still have the book. I think there needs to be more there for them when they come through, when they're ready to open up. What works for one doesn't work for all. And I was always on that constant search to try to find the right way, or how should I get through this? And I felt like a failure because those self-help books didn't help. And I think, they have AA for alcoholics, but what is there for victims? I think to have a supportive group, or to have somebody there at the time or soon after to help them process, so they're not alone, feeling like they have to heal on their own. They don't have to stay in the dark. They can come into the light, if that makes any sense.
Oh my goodness, Julia, it makes a lot of sense. And, we keep going back to the terminology safe place. It is trying to find that safe place to just simply allow healing to come in, because there has to be a safe place for healing to enter, because otherwise we just wall it all off because it's not safe. And we're constantly trying to defend, what's trying to break through those walls.
Hypervigilant.
Yeah, absolutely. What you just shared I think is one of the most powerful statements for a family justice center, which I am a big, big, big proponent of family justice centers. I think they are the exact spaces that you and I are talking about, which they are spaces meant specifically for crime victims, especially violent crime victims, domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, those types of crimes, those family justice centers. That's what they're there for. And they offer those resources in that safe space. So, what you said is just so critical to those needs. And thankfully, you and I live in a community where our city is looking at the investment in a family justice center and building a family justice center here. Julie, it's because of people like you. It's because of survivors like you that share your voice, and not every survivor can. Not every survivor has the ability to overcome, has the ability to feel like they can share their story. Not every survivor has the support system to do that, and not every survivor wants to. And whatever the decision that survivor makes, that's right. That's right. They've got to make that decision for them. But your voice, Julia, has changed laws in our state. Your voice is making things happen in our state. And I'm so proud of you and so honored and proud to call you friend. In our last question, it's one of the questions that I ask everyone on this podcast, and your question's a little bit different. So as we wrap up this conversation, Julia, I'd like to leave our listeners with key actions they can take to create or increase their safety. What actions do you think are most important for people to make a habit of to increase their safety?
A couple of things that I learned from my violent attack is to always trust your gut instinct. Just like my daughter's friend that just felt something was off that morning. And I just passed it off as just being, it was dark and it's early in the morning and their safety and numbers were fine. And I feel it's better to overreact and be wrong than to ignore it and be right. And that almost cost me my life. When I heard those footsteps coming up behind me, I dismissed it as another jogger, that I was probably being paranoid. It would be light soon and I was almost to Broadwater and I would be meeting up with my boyfriend and, I was fine. I wasn't really truly aware of my surroundings. I was just thinking, oh, it's a beautiful day, thinking about my day ahead. I should have looked behind me and looked around and been more aware. I should have been alert. And my inattentiveness gave my perpetrator the upper hand, because he was able to run up behind me and put me in a chokehold in the blink of an eye before I could even react. Also, to try to avoid being taken to a second location, because they say your survival drastically decreases once they get you to that second location. And I fought hard and was not successful in getting away from him to prevent him from dragging me between those two businesses. But I was no match for his strength. And then also, don't get into a stranger's car. Don't get out of the car if your safety is in doubt. And always be aware if you're being followed. I think they say make, 3 right-hand turns? And then if you think you are being followed, to call the police and they can direct you as to where to go. They say sometimes, especially in rural Montana, a lot of times the sheriff and or the police are out patrolling the area. So there's not always somebody there at the police station. So dial 911 and have them direct you as to what to do or where to go. I heard this in a self-defense class, is to prioritize being safe over being nice. If the perpetrator is attacking you, they're not being nice. You need to fight with all you have if that's how you feel. I mean, like some situations, if you do fight, it cannot be good. But I would rather go down swinging and fighting than being 6 foot under. A perfect example is Ted Bundy. That's how he got his victims. He would pretend to be, he'd have his arm in a sling or pretend to be hurt and ask the young women to help him put his groceries in his car. And then they found their bodies later. So just always be aware of your surroundings.
Yeah, you're right. I do a training on serial killers, and they're all master manipulators. Serial killers and human traffickers have the exact same qualities.
Mm-hmm.
They're master manipulators. They're violent people,
Yeah.
But it's mostly master manipulation. And the difference between a trafficker and a buyer is the trafficker is the master manipulator. Exact same qualities of a serial killer. Julia, the things that you've shared with us today. I know they're not easy, and I'm grateful that you spent this time with us today to talk, to share your story, to give voice to other people out there, which I don't doubt that there are survivors of other sexually violent crimes that are listening to you today and feeling empowered by what you are saying. Parents, family members who you refer to as secondary survivors, feeling empowered by you today. And thank you for your voice. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for fighting. You fought, you survived. You did everything right. And hold that. What was done to you was wrong. You did everything right. I'm honored that you are my friend. I'm proud to call you friend. And I think you are one of the greatest human beings walking the earth. So keep walking there, girl.
Back at you, friend. I'm so thankful
keep
for
walking
you.
there.
And thank you.
Yep.
Yep. I'm just thankful that I found you and you helped me so much. One of the things that I hold near and dear to my heart is getting some more legislation passed. I know there were a lot of laws introduced and some passed in this last legislative session that gave more power to the perpetrators. We need to flip that. And I don't know what I'm doing. And I thought, how do I learn if I don't ask? And I go to the people that have that knowledge. And
correct.
You just welcome this gangly, unsure of herself, but determined person that wants to change the laws. And I'm still working on that one that we had talked about, Katie's Law.
And the hard part, and I told this to you when we were sitting there, that sadly, it takes so much time. It takes so much time. It should not take as long as it does. In my opinion, it is criminal that it takes as long as it does to pass good laws to make our country more safe for children, for adults, for vulnerable populations. It's criminal that it takes as long as it does. And that's a whole other conversation, but we're going to get that law passed. Thank you for being with us today, Julia.
Thank you.
And for the important work you're doing. We will have information on the topics that we discussed today on our task force website at yhttf.org. To our listeners, thank you for listening and thank you for sharing this journey with us.